Our final speaker for today is Richard Freeman, and Richard is a working cryptozoologist. He searches for and writes about unknown animals. Basically, he's a monster hunter. He's hunted for creatures such as the Yeti, the Mongolian deathworm, the giant anaconda, the Almaski, orang pendek, the gull, the narka, the ninki nanka, the Caspian tiger, and the Tasmanian wolf. He's the zoological director of the Centre for Fortean Zoology, the world's only full-time mystery animal research organisation based in North Devon in England. A former zookeeper, Richard has worked with over 400 species from spiders to elephants, but he lists crocodiles as his favourite. He's written books about cryptozoology, folklore and monsters. His latest work is an overview of cryptozoology and a chronicle of his own expeditions entitled Adventures in Cryptozoology, Volumes 1 and 2. And Richard's talk is going to be in search of real monsters, not prophets, oracles and seers. The pictures are the correct ones, don't worry. So ladies and gentlemen, Richard Freeman.
Before I go into my actual talk, I have to correct something that Ron Halliday said. He said nobody ever sees dragons anymore. That's wrong. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of modern-day dragon sightings from all around the world, from the USA, Iceland, Great Britain, South Africa, and right across Asia. I'm currently investigating a modern-day dragon sighting at Waverley Abbey in Surrey, which happened on the 27th of December 2003. And I've interviewed 5 of the 10 witnesses, and they're all perfectly sane. And they all saw huge winged reptilian animals flying around the ruins of this abbey at night. I can do a whole talk, in fact I do a whole talk on modern-day dragon sightings. And what might be behind them. And if you want me to come back next year, I can do this talk on modern day sightings of dragons, because there are multiple dragon sightings. I'm not suggesting that there are gigantic winged reptiles unknown to science flying around Britain and other areas. These are clearly paranormal entities, a paranormal manifestation. And in fact, the dragon is probably the most ancient and widespread of all paranormal manifestations, and it's still with us today. People are still seeing dragons. But that's a totally different talk. What I'm talking about today are flesh and blood animals, not paranormal entities. They are creatures unknown to science, and it's about my work looking for these animals. But let's have a quick background on what cryptozoology is and what it's linked with. This is Professor Bernard Heuvelmans. That's him there. He's the less hairy one. He was a Belgian zoologist, and way back in the 1950s he wrote a book called On the Track of Unknown Animals. And Heuvelmans has been all over the world studying animals, and he believed that a lot of folklore about strange creatures were based on animals utterly unknown to science. There were people before him, like the German Willy Ley, who had written books on unknown animals, but Heuvelmans was the first really to coin the word cryptozoology, and he's considered the father of cryptozoology. This guy here is Ivan T. Sanderson. He was a Scottish zoologist and explorer. He was sort of like David Attenborough before David Attenborough. And in the 1920s, the 1930s, and right up till the 70s, he went out looking for all kinds of creatures and making documentaries about them and writing books about them. His father was actually bored to death by a rhinoceros in Africa, and he claims to have had encounters with a number of strange creatures, including an enormous bat in Africa. But he is another one who's considered one of the fathers of cryptozoology. Some countries have treated cryptozoology much more seriously than others, including the former Soviet Union. In the 1950s, they had a commission. The Soviet government had what they called the Snowman Commission, which was a government-backed group of people that tried to look for evidence of relic hominins, that is, relatives of the ancestors of man that are still alive today in places like the Caucasus Mountains and the Pamirs, and some very important people were involved. That is Peter Smolin there, who was the head of the Darwin Museum in Moscow. Boris Prozhnev, he was a Russian polymath who wrote numerous books on various subjects from history to mystery animals. And the organisation I work for, the Centre for Fortean Zoology, a couple of years ago translated one of his lost books. There were only ever 300 copies ever written, and they were in Russian. We got hold of a copy, had it translated, and published it for the first time in English. So all that Soviet information on wild men was available in English for the first time. And that lady here, she only just died a couple of years ago, just a few years shy of her, I think, 95th birthday, and her name was Marie-Jeanne Kaufmann, and she was half French, half Russian, and she was a mountaineer. She became a major in the army in the Second World War, and she spent some time in a gulag as well, but after the war she heard about strange creature sightings in the Caucasus Mountains, and she spent most of her life after that on the trail of the Almasty, the Russian wildlands. And she never wrote a book, but she amassed masses of notes, and after her death we don't really know what's happened to them. So there are some creatures now that we know exist, that once upon a time were thought to be totally mythological. This is the giant squid, Architeuthis dux. This is not a very big one. The largest reliably measured one washed up in the 1870s in the wonderfully named Thimble Tickle Bay in Newfoundland, and it was 55 feet long. But there are sightings of much, much bigger ones. There was a guy called Pierre Denis de Montfort in the late 18th century and early 19th century, who was an expert on mollusks. And he was one of the most celebrated biologists in Europe, and he went as far afield as Egypt, collecting specimens for the Paris Natural History Museum. And he got talking to whalers from Nantucket who had settled in Paris, and they told him about finding great sucker marks on the sperm whales that they killed. And sometimes in their death throes, the sperm whales would vomit up huge tentacles. And he realised that what we were dealing with was a gigantic squid, and this was behind the legends, the Nordic legends of the Kraken. And he wrote a book about this and became a scientific pariah. He lost his job, no one would employ him, and he died of starvation in a Parisian gutter in 1820. In the 1850s, the first specimen of Architeuthis dux was procured by science, so he was right all along, and they get a lot bigger than that. The mountain gorilla was thought of as a hairy giant from native folklore. Keep that in mind. It couldn't possibly exist, it was just an ogre, an ogre made up by superstitious tribes, until the early part of the 20th century, when the first specimens were actually shot and brought back to Europe. The okapi is a relative of the giraffe. For years, there were rumours from the pygmies in the Congo of a creature that was half zebra, half giraffe. And nobody believed them until the okapi was caught at the turn of the last century. Its closest relatives are known from the fossil record from the Middle East, and they're 15 million years old. That's another animal that was thought of as being completely mythological, and it turned out to be real. The Komodo dragon, the world's largest lizard, it grows to around 10 feet long. It has razor sharp teeth and venomous saliva. You often see pictures of them with all this drool around their mouths, a bit like me when I think about goth girls. But it's packed with anticoagulant venom, and they can kill animals as big as water buffalo, and they even eat human beings. Until relatively recently in Australia, there was a creature called Varanus priscus, better known as Megalania, which was a relative of the Komodo dragon, but it was 3 times as long, up to 30 feet long, the size of a bus. And there are rumours of giant lizards still lurking in the jungles of New Guinea even today. The coelacanth. This was a fish known only from the fossil record. It was thought to have died out with the non-avian dinosaurs 65 million years ago, until they started turning up alive and well in the nets of South African fishermen. And they live off the coast of South Africa and Madagascar in deep seas. And a second species has been discovered since then in Indonesia. The Chicoan peccary, a type of wild pig, again known from the fossil record up till the last ice age, turned up in 1977 in South America, not in a deep jungle, but on the grasslands of South America. More recently, the pygmy tapir has been discovered in South America, a whole new species of tapir. They're related to rhinos and horses. So, the precedent is there for there being unknown species of animal, and my job is to go and look for them. In the deserts of the Gobi, the nomads go in great terror of a creature that they call Auroi hoi hoi, which translates as intestine worm, because they say it looks like a great length of cow's intestine. And this creature crawls up to the surface after rainfall in the hottest months. And the legend is it can spit a corrosive yellow saliva that acts like acid, but it can also kill with great blasts of electricity, powerful enough to kill a camel. And the nomads are terrified of it. We call it the Mongolian death worm. It first came to Western attention due to the writings of a guy called Roy Chapman Andrews, who was a paleontologist, and he was the model for, what's his name? Indiana Jones, thank you, Indiana Jones. Well, of course, he's an archaeologist rather than a paleontologist. But he went, back in the Soviet days, in the communist days, he went to explore Mongolia looking for fossils, and he was told by the premier of Mongolia to look out for the Auroi hoi hoi, the death worm. And he wrote about it in his book. Another cryptid reported today is the Tasmanian wolf. Now, with the death worm, it's a creature utterly unknown to science, completely unknown to science, and that's one kind of cryptid. Another kind of cryptid is the Tasmanian wolf. This is a creature we know for sure existed, and it's a flesh-eating marsupial, and it's a great example of convergent evolution. Looking at that, you would think it was some sort of member of the dog family, but it's not. It's a flesh-eating marsupial. It's more closely related to kangaroos and Tasmanian devils, and actually there's something called the fat-tailed dunnart is its closest living relative. It had a backward-facing pouch to protect the young, and in males to protect their testicles. It had this very long, stiff, kangaroo-like tail, these great gaping jaws with a bite more powerful than a wolf. And these things were supposed to have been hunted into extinction in the 1930s because they preyed on the white settlers' sheep. When the white settlers first got to Tasmania, they wiped out the Tasmanian emu. They shot the Tasmanian Aborigines like you would shoot rabbits. They actually went beating for the Aborigines and then shot them. And they did their damnedest to wipe out the Tasmanian wolf, but still people still report it today, including zoologists and park rangers have seen this thing. So if there's one animal above all of us, I think really actually exists, has the best chance of existing, it's this one. So we've got two categories so far of cryptids: the unknowns and the supposedly extinct ones that are still around. And another category is known animals that have got to gigantic sizes. Chief among them are the giant anaconda, known to the gauchos, the South American cowboys as the Manatoro, the bull killer, because they were so large they could constrict full-grown bulls and horses and swallow them whole. The biggest known anaconda is about 28 feet long. There are persistent reports from the tropical rivers of South America of anacondas over twice that length. Other examples would be giant crocodiles, giant pythons. There was a Belgian fighter pilot called Remy van Leyden, very courageous man who had been taken prisoner of war in World War II. He escaped, got to England on foot, joined the RAF and became a commander. And after the war, he was a charter pilot, and he photographed, his friend photographed as he flew over a clearing in the jungle, a gigantic python that came up out of a hole in the jungle near Katanga in the Congo, and he reckoned it was 50 feet long. And his friend managed to snap a photograph of it as he passed over, and it said it reared up about 10 feet as if it was trying to strike at the helicopter. And recently, because in the photograph there's certain rock formations, someone's found those rock formations on Google Earth, and he said he was 40 metres up, so they worked out how big the snake would have been if he was 40 metres up by patching his photograph over the image from Google Earth, and they found that he was bang on. This snake would have been 50 feet long. So, my own expeditions. The creature I've looked for the most is this thing, the orang pendek. It's known from the jungles of the Indonesian island of Sumatra. Ever since the first Dutch European settlers got there, they were hearing stories about this creature in the forest. It's supposed to be 3 to 5 feet tall, but immensely strong, powerfully built, covered with dark hair that can be grey, brownish or reddish in colour, and oftentimes with a long mane of hair at the top. It's been seen by a woman called Debbie Martyr, who used to be the head of the Indonesian Tiger Conservation Group, and also by the wildlife photographer James Chivers. So I've taken 6 expeditions out there to look for this creature. I could easily do a talk about any one of these expeditions for an hour, but I'm going to have to zip through it fairly quickly. That's us on a very battered old canoe that looked like it come off the bloody ark, crossing this lake called Gunung Tuju, which is in the caldera of an extinct volcano in Kerinci Sablat National Park, which is Orang Pendek Central. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of sightings from there. And our native guide, Sahar, had seen the creature himself. On one of our expeditions, Sahar and one of my friends, Dave Archer, saw the Orang Pendek squatting in a tree, and they said it was hunched up next to the tree, trying not to be seen, and its face had an alarmed look on it. And when it realised it had been spotted, it came down out of the tree and walked away on 2 legs like a man. And he described its fur looking very like a mountain gorilla's, very shaggy, but powerfully built, very robust, and about 4 feet tall. I've stumbled across many footprints and handprints of the Orang Pendek. This is one of them, and you can see here 1, 2, 3, 4 toes at the front, and the prehensile toe here at the side, and the very broad heel. I used to be a zookeeper, and I specialised in reptiles, but I also work with a hell of a lot of apes, and I can tell you that that footprint is unlike any other ape. The construction of it is unlike any other ape. That is a handprint. There's the thumb, 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers. And that we found where we followed the creature through the jungle, and it had fallen down onto all fours to climb up a slope. And it's not like the hand of an orangutan, it's much more like the hand of a small gorilla. Orangutans have very small vestigial thumbs. This thing has a much larger thumb. That is a local man there who had seen the Orang Pendek, and There was a semi-cultivated area around the jungle, and he saw it there, and it seemed to be raiding his crops. And he heard it making a sort of like hoo, hoo, hoo noise, and described it as being very robust, powerfully built, and it frightened him when he saw it. This is the Titanarum, the biggest flower in the world, and it stinks like rotting flesh because it's fertilised by flies. It attracts flies to fertilise it, and they only flower once every 14 years, so we were lucky to see that in the jungle near to where he had had his eyewitness account. This is Debbie Marta. She's an English woman who's retired now, but she used to be the head of the Indonesian Tiger Conservation Group. And she'd heard about the Orang Pendek when she was over there, thought it was just a local legend, until she was in the jungle and all the Siamang gibbons started to whoop as if something was disturbing them. And her guide went around to try and flush whatever the animal was out into a clearing so she could see it. And she was expecting to see a sun bear or something like that. And instead she saw an upright walking, powerfully built ape. This is some hair that was found near tracks on one of our expeditions. And it was sent to a guy called Lars Thomas, who is a Danish biologist who specialises in identifying mammal hair. Now, the DNA on it was too damaged to be of any use, but he looked at the structure of the hair itself, and he concluded that it was from a large unknown primate, related to but distinct from the orangutan. So we think that the Orang Pendek is a ground-dwelling, upright-walking relative of the orangutan. And it's the animal I've been after the most, and doubtless I'll be back again sometime on its track to try and catch it on film. These guys here, that guy is Chris Clark, who comes on a lot of our expeditions. The fellow there was our guide, he's called Sahaba. Sadly, he died of kidney disease at a very young age. These people, the Kebu, the original natives of Sumatra. Most of the Sumatrans today come from Malaysia. These were the original people, much taller with much curlier hair, and they, until relatively recently, lived completely in the forest. These days they live some of the time in houses, but they still spend a lot of the time living and hunting in the forest. They don't even have bows and arrows, they just use spears. This guy was called Nylam, and he was one of the chiefs of the Kebu, and he said that on one of his hunting expeditions, he and his friends heard something coming through the jungle, so they got up into the tree, and an Orang Pendek walked into the clearing, and it was looking about as if it could sense that there was someone there, but they watched it for a good long time before it disappeared again into the forest. This is another witness. His name was Pak N, and he guided us down to what we call the Lost Valley. There was a valley which no Westerner had ever been down before, and he had seen the Orang Pendek a few years before in the general area, and he likened it to Mike Tyson, who was so powerfully built. And he said it was walking through the forest, and as it was going, it was grabbing food like leaves and berries and stuff, and stuffing them into its mouth as it went. And it saw him stop, turn around and walk the opposite way. But he led us down this valley that had 500-foot sheer cliffs, and we had no rope. But we got down because we're Englishmen. We climbed down and we spent a day in the valley, but we found nothing. But we think that it's too much of an effort for the Orang Pendek to go down there, because there's not a hell of a lot for it to eat down in this very narrow river valley. But it felt weird to be the first Westerner ever to set foot in the valley. And he said that even the natives very rarely go down there. He went down there once when he was a boy. This is us in the valley. Some members of our team, that's John Hare and Chris Clark. And you see these are like the sheer cliffs we had to clamber down. This is us in the Gobi Desert on the trail of the Mongolian Death Worm. And we travelled for about 1,000 miles for 3 weeks through the Gobi, and talked to about 24 witnesses who were all describing the same animal. They said it was scaly, reddy brown in colour, about as long as a human arm and about as thick as a human arm, shaped a bit like a sausage or a salami. It's hard to tell which end was the head and the tail. It's hard to make out any features on it. All of them were terrified of it. One old man said he'd seen it as a child in the 30s when tending his family's livestock, camels and goats, and they were so terrified that they packed up their gur, the circular tents that they have, and moved themselves and all the livestock to another area. The sighting of a death worm can cause a panic that goes right through a community. We met a young guy in his 30s who'd just seen it the year before we were there, in an oasis. This is Wall Canyon, one of the oases where the death worm has been seen, very remote areas. And we stopped with one family in their gur, and the guy who's actually employed by the Parks Department, he said he'd seen a death worm slithering out of a hole years before, and his wife had seen one killing and eating a mouse. This is John in some ice caves. Now you think of deserts as being hot, but the Gobi is a very cold desert. It gets very cold at night and very cold in winter. And this is part of a river that until recently never ever thawed, and the wind has made these weird ice caves that we went into. Being in the Gobi Desert is the closest thing I've come to being on another planet or in another world, because it's so utterly alien. Parts of it look like giant cat litter trays going off into infinity. Other parts of it are covered with chips of mica, and they call that the mirror. Other parts look like the surface of Mars. We were caught in several sandstorms, which is sort of like aggressive fog. And we actually saw mirages in the desert. You hear about mirages that look like Great Lakes, but it's just like heat haze. And other ones look like cities with minarets, but they were just heat haze. It's an absolutely incredible, weird place. And one time we had a dust devil when we were at a oasis. We had a dust devil form out in the desert, and it came closer and closer and closer and closer, and then suddenly it was on the camp. And I felt like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, because I was clinging onto the van, and I looked up into the eye of the tornado to see one of our drivers 15 foot up in the air being spun round and round by the wind, and it completely wrecked the camp. This is the terrain you're dealing with. We came to the conclusion that the death worm is not a worm at all. A true annelid worm couldn't live in a place as arid as this. It's some sort of burrowing reptile. It's quite possibly a worm lizard or amphisbaena, which are creatures related to lizards and snakes, but they're in a little group of their own. They're neither true lizards or true snakes. They're these weird sausage-shaped, or to be honest, dick-shaped, burrowing reptiles. It could be an undiscovered large species of one of those, or possibly a sand boa, a stocky constricting snake that lives in deserts. But whatever it is, it's unknown to science. This is us around the camp. That is a worm lizard, or amphisbaena. That's one from South America. But something like that, but bigger and chunkier, could be living as an undiscovered species, burrowing in the sands of the Gobi Desert. Perhaps the most famous cryptid, the Tasmanian wolf that I mentioned earlier, is supposed to have been hunted into extinction in the 1930s, the last one dying in Dumaire's Zoo in Hobart in 1937. But it's been called the healthiest extinct animal you will ever meet. because there has been over 4,000 sightings of it, both in Tasmania and mainland Australia, and up in the jungles and mountains of New Guinea as well, where it's known from the fossil record. So I've been over to Tasmania 3 times now, looking for this creature. This is one of the witnesses. Her name was Ramora, and she'd been driving along one night in central Tasmania when one of these creatures crossed the road in front of her, and she said it had the long stiff tail, the stripes on its back, and its gait was very different from a dog. It moved in a more stiff manner because of course they're marsupials, their legs are built differently from placental dogs and wolves, and she got a good view of it in her car headlights. This is the sort of terrain that you're dealing with. Tasmania is roughly the size of Ireland, but there are less than 500,000 people living there, and most of those live in Hobart and Launceston, the 2 main cities. A village in Tasmania is more like a hamlet, and when you get to the west of the island, places like the Franklin-Gordon wilderness and the mountains in central Tasmania, you get wilderness like this that goes on for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. And it's full of wallabies and kangaroos and possums and other species of animal that would be prey for the Tasmanian wolf. We would set up camera traps, baited with meat. We'd use roadkill wallabies, chickens and things like that. There's the camera trap to try and attract the animal itself. One time I was in a very remote area of Tasmania going along a forest path, and back in the early part of the 20th century, the old bushmen who knew this animal, a lot of them had been in the Boer War, and they swore that it had a smell very similar to a hyena. And one of the nicknames for it was the hyena because of this smell. And I know what a hyena smells like. I used to be a zookeeper. And I got this very hyena-like smell on this remote forest, as if something had just crossed the path minutes before. This guy we interviewed, he runs an arboretum or tree place. And he's been in Tasmania. He moved over from the mainland in the 60s. And a few years before we got there, he said he was driving with his wife between Launceston and Hobart, and he saw a Tasmanian wolf running along the side of the road, and it looked like it was looking to get under a barbed wire fence, looking for a place to get under. And he got a very good look at it, and there was a car full of people behind him, and they saw it as well, and there was a subsequent report in the local newspaper about it. So this is not a fleeting glimpse of something darting off into the shadows. This is something he saw and had in view for quite a good time. This guy here, he's employed by the Parks Department to cull feral cats, which are a bloody nuisance. He goes out shooting cats, because cats have been brought over there and they kill a lot of the small mammals and birds, and they breed like hell. Whenever cats get established anywhere, they're a threat to small native wildlife, and he goes out shooting them. He's seen a Tasmanian wolf twice, once from his car, again walking in front of his car, which is a very, very common thing, and another time when he was on foot, and he talked to a park ranger who had seen it as well. Another guy we talked to, who's sadly passed away now, is an old man who worked for a hydroelectric scheme, and he was driving to work in the 1970s with his friends, and there was 5 of them in the car, and they all saw a Tasmanian wolf come out into the road in front of them, and they watched it for a good long time. That guy there is Mike Williams. He's an Australian cryptozoologist and thylacine hunter. This is a roadkill Bennett's wallaby. You get these wild in Britain and fairer in places like the Isle of Man and in Derbyshire and parts of Devon. There's loads of them in the Isle of Man. I've seen them knocking around the Isle of Man. This guy here is a friend of mine who eats roadkill in Britain. He goes out and finds deer and badgers and foxes that have been knocked over and takes them home and puts them in the fridge and eats them. So he butchered it, and we used it as bait, and we had enough left over for a barbecue. So we ate wallaby. Very chewy. This guy has the wonderful name of Grenville Batty, and he is the great nephew of the man who shot the last known wild thylacine. And he says he's heard the very distinctive call of the thylacine. It's a spasmodic, high-pitched yip, yip, yip. And he says he's heard this many times. And we also talked to a park ranger who said he'd heard this very distinctive call as well. And this guy was good enough to lend us some accommodation. He says, oh, I've got a shack up in the outback you can use if you like. And because we've been camping in the forest, and I hate camping. I camp through necessity while hunting strange creatures. Anyone who goes camping for fun, there's something wrong with you. You must be a masochist. We got to his shack and found out it was this wonderful multi-room bungalow. And he said, oh, there's no electricity. That's because he hadn't put the generator on. We just had to switch the generator on. We got electricity and running water, so we used it as a base. That's the skull of the thylacine. We were sponsored by Toyota, who gave us a Land Rover on several of our expeditions to deal with the rough terrain. You can see how broad and how wide the jaws could open, much wider than a placental wolf, and it had a much more powerful bite. But the skull wasn't made for hanging on to struggling prey. Wolves hunt in packs, they get round prey, bite onto it and hang on, and they often start eating it alive before it's dead. The thylacine bit, then let go and let the prey bleed to death. Then it ate the highly vasculated organs. It's almost certainly still out there. This is some of the terrain you're dealing with. This is close to where I had the smell of the hyena-like smell that may have been a thylacine. Another animal, the giant anaconda, Sakuraju gigante. This is an alleged photograph of a fantastically large anaconda that was supposed to have been machine gunned to death by soldiers it attacked in Brazil, and it's floating belly up dead in a river, and it does look very big, but we don't know how far away the cameraman was when he shot it, so we haven't really got any scale to tell us how big it is, although it does look like a big bulky animal. I went over to Guyana to search for this creature. We were led by a guy called Damon Corrie, who is the hereditary chief of the Eagle Clan Arawak tribe. And it was one of the few cases we got sponsorship. Usually we sponsor it out of our own pocket. In this case, Capcom put up money for us to do this because they wanted to tie it in with their Monster Hunter game. But they wanted us to go in October when they were releasing the game. Unfortunately, it was in the middle of a drought, and the locals said they'd never known it so hot. And we were out on the savannah, we weren't in the jungle, because the swamps on the savannah is where a lot of these have been reported in Guyana. Damon Corrie said there was this remote lake called Corona Falls, and he had talked to some members of his tribe that seen an immense anaconda there, so big that they ran away, they were terrified of it. And when he asked them how big it was, they pointed to a palm tree, and they said there was a dead tree in the swamp as big as that, and it was crawling over it, and its head was over one side and its tail was over the other, so it was 40 foot plus. But it was mercilessly, murderously hot. Usually I can deal with heat, it's cold that gets to me, but here, no shade. It was blisteringly hot, and we couldn't get out to Corona Falls because the rivers were too low. We got into these swamps. This is a track of an anaconda. That's an average sized one, it's not a giant one. Chris is there for a guide to how big it was. But it was so hot that I suffered from heat stroke. I collapsed, and at one time, in order to get some relief, I stood in a a dirty little pool about half the size of this stage that had a few trees and bushes around it, trying to get some kind of relief. We got torn apart by insects. There are these things called vine flies, and one morning they'd bitten my arse and it swollen up, and my then girlfriend photographed my naked arse. Thankfully, I'm not going to show it you, but it looked like a giant mutant diseased strawberry that was grown at Sellafield. There's Damon Corrie in his get-up, and we stayed with him at the native village of Pakuri, and the native people there are incredibly hospitable and kind. But unfortunately, it was one of the least successful expeditions we did because we could do so little, because it was so murderously hot, and we couldn't get to the places we wanted to go to because of how low the waters were. I'd like to go back and have another crack at the giant anaconda, but go in the rainy season. This is Damon looking at another trail through the swamps. At the time, it's so hot the snakes are all excavating. They're buried down in the mud, avoiding the heat. He did take us to see an ancient burial, an ancient squat burial in the mountains, and it was the burial of a shaman, and he was buried in a huge pot, and there was a child sacrifice. A young boy had been sacrificed, and there were beads there as well, and this is from well over 100 years ago. This guy here, it's not a very clear photograph, but how many of you have ever met a genuine cannibal? This guy's called Ernesto, and we met him on a ranch, and he is an actual real cannibal, and he's really nice. He's a nice cannibal. Everybody needs a hobby. And what happened was a pilot crashed up in the mountains, and the pilot's family asked him to go and look in the mountains for the body. And he found the crash site, found the body, was bringing it down, got lost in the mists, and he was up there so long he had to eat the arm of the corpse. Quite what he told the parents when he got back, I don't know. Maybe he offered to shit into the grave or something. That is me looking very uncomfortable in that terrible parched terrain. That's us trekking towards the mountains. We never did get out to the lake because it was too dry. One of our members fell down a mountain and broke her thumb. Another creature we went on the track of was the Russian wild man, or almasty, that I mentioned earlier. This is quite distinct from the Yeti. It's smaller than the Yeti and more man-like, and they took it very seriously. At the time they thought it was a surviving Neanderthal, although today it seems, well, we know more about Neanderthals. The Neanderthals were very like us, very sophisticated. They had fire, they made tools, they made art, they had clothes. If you washed a Neanderthal, shaved him, put him in a modern day suit, he could walk down any street in Britain, and you might think he was a bit ugly, but he'd be clearly a human. The almasty is bigger, hairier, more primitive. It doesn't have fire, it will hurl rocks, swing clubs, things like that. So it's probably a much more primitive hominin, maybe an offshoot of Homo erectus or Homo habilis. There's another sketch of what these things are supposed to look like. This guy is Gregory Panchenko. He was a Ukrainian biologist. This is back in the days before that happy shopper Hitler, Putin, declared war on Ukraine. So he went over with a mixed team of Brits, Ukrainians and Russians to look for this creature. That's the sort of terrain we were dealing with, and we met lots of people that had seen them, including a doctor of geology who was the deputy of Elbrus National Park, and he'd been out looking for lost sheep, and he'd encountered one of these things walking up a mountain. It's supposed to be about 7 feet tall, covered with hair. We heard stories of them going into remote farms, killing guard dogs with clubs and making away with food and stuff. And we staked out an old farmhouse where these things had been abandoned since the early 70s. These things were supposed to appear there. Not so long ago, a group of shepherds had seen an almasty around this place. So we staked it out, we put the camera traps up, we put bait out, and a lot of the witnesses we spoke to said they make a bird-like twittering noise. And 10 o'clock at night, in the pitch dark, we heard a bird-like twittering noise, and one of the camera traps went off. And I thought, wow, have we caught the almasty on tape, on our picture? So nothing happened for a few hours, so we went back into the farm to warm ourselves around an old stove, and the door to this room we were in was ajar. It was a jar about a couple of inches, and there was moonlight, starlight coming in. Suddenly we hear a guttural vocalisation, sort of a boom, 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 boom sound. And I said to one of my colleagues, "Did you hear that?" He said, "Yeah." And something walked along the veranda, and as it walked past that door, it blocked off the moonlight star to a height of 7 feet, so it was on its hind legs, whatever it was. So we grabbed our cameras, rushed out, but whatever it was had disappeared into the darkness. And in the morning, when we checked the cameras, all we got was movement of vegetation. This is us looking at a cave. We talked to so many witnesses, but I haven't got time to tell you about all of them. The Yeti isn't white, that's a complete fallacy. The Yeti is reddish, brown or black, it's never white. We went on the trail of the Yeti in India, in the Garo Hills in the north of the country, where the local name for it is Monday Barung, the forest man. That is a track we found near a forest stream in the Garo Hills. We couldn't cast it because there's too much water in it, but we followed these tracks, and whatever it was had gone along, and it was heaving over boulders and getting freshwater crabs, boulders that no man could have ever moved. That's the team, and behind us is Knockwreck Gorge, which is a great valley that nobody ever goes into. We talked to many witnesses here. One guy had seen a female suckling a baby whilst eating bamboo, and even sitting down, she was 5 feet tall. The general description we got is something like a gorilla, but walking on its hind legs with long black hair and moving bipedally, about 3 metres or 10 feet tall. Another guy said he saw one build a nest in the way that gorillas build nests, and he watched it from a hilltop as it made this huge nest. And he showed other people from the village the nest that it made. We talked to an old tribal leader who had seen it, and it was roaring and shaking the bushes like a gorilla does when it does its threat display. So we think that the Yeti is a real animal. One theory is that it's a surviving form of Gigantopithecus, a giant ape known from the Pleistocene epoch in Asia. That's a human skull, that's a gorilla skull, that's a Gigantopithecus skull, but they're only known from the teeth and the jaw bones. The rest of this skull is hypothetical. But we know it fed mainly on bamboo and rough fibrous material, whereas the Yeti is more of an omnivore. It will eat plants and vegetation, but it also killed yaks by hurling rocks at them and eat the meat. So it might be something different. It might be a gigantic form of hominin rather than an ape. This is the terrain where the creature is said to live, and the jungle is unbroken from Knockwreck National Park in Meghalaya, and it goes all the way through Assam where the Yeti is called Konglang Po, all the way to Bhutan, where there are lots of reports of the Yeti, and it's called the Maigor. This is some caves he went into, Siju Caves, where the creature has been seen, and its tracks have been seen, and it's been heard bellowing, and these caves go on for miles and miles and miles. That's us in the caves. And we also talked to a guy who had seen the arm of one of them preserved. It was just the forearm. He said it was covered in grey fur, and just the forearm was as long as his arm. Some bones we found, they turned out to be human, not. Fantastic stalactites in the caves. That was one of the tribal leaders that had seen the Yeti, or the Mande Barung as they call it. This is Tajikistan, the wilds of Tajikistan, where we went in search of the gul and the Caspian tiger. The gul is a sort of wild man that's supposed to live there, different from the other sorts of wild man. About 5'5", highly aggressive, will hurl rocks and stones and attack people. That guy was a biology teacher who actually got attacked by one of them and had to fight it off. And we also looked for the Caspian tiger, a creature that is supposed to have been extinct since the 1960s, and we met so many people that have seen them. Mullahs at mosques, hunters who've seen them, honey farmers, everyone. A guy who worked for the national parks had seen one a month to the day before we were there, a Caspian tiger. And I haven't really got much more time. I'll have to sit through that. That was another guy who was attacked by a gul, one of these wild men. And that was the picture they chose that was more closely like the gul than anything else. Smaller than a Yeti, but it has these weird thumbs set very far back on the hand, more like the hand of a chimpanzee, whereas stuff like the Yeti and the Almasty seem to have more of an opposable grip. But they hurl rocks and attack people. This is the Caspian tiger, so its thick beard there is very similar to the Siberian tiger. The last time we were there, we talked to a person, a farmer who was there when we were there. A couple of hours further down the valley from where we were, he heard his dogs barking at night, went out to see what was happening. They were all around the bottom of a tree. He shooed all the dogs off. In the tree was a tiger. And that happened when we were in the same valley, but 2 hours away. So the Caspian tiger is almost certainly still around. That guy there was a honey farmer, and he was attacked by 2 gulls that hurled rocks at him, and he had to run to a mill and shut himself in the mill, and they were pounding on the door and jumping on the ceiling. I have to say that people in Tajikistan were some of the most hospitable and kind-hearted people in the world. I've been all over the world, and I've found that particularly Muslims are very, very hospitable, and they're good people. And in Tajikistan, they overwhelm you. They love honey. They'll drink goblets of honey. And they love egg and chips. It's like being in Birmingham or something. You go anywhere, they'll bring you out egg and chips because they love it, and goblets of honey. That's another fella who'd seen the Caspian tiger and the gul. We set up camera traps, and we got a bear, wild boar, but no Caspian tiger. And I've been to Tajikistan 3 times now. I intend to go back because we think we've narrowed it down to a place called the Romit Valley, where the Caspian tiger is still there. And the amount of sightings they have suggests that it's there in a viable population. What are we going to do next? There are plans for us to go to Japan, to Iriamoti Island, which is part of an archipelago off the south of Japan, to look for a new species of cat, unknown to science. We might be going to Flores, the island of Flores, to look for the little hobbit people, Homo floresiensis, because Gregory IV, the anthropologist, says he's collected lots of reports from the east of the island of these things surviving. They're supposed to have died out 50,000 years ago, but they'll be still being seen there. I'm involved with a French-German science documentary company called Arte, and there at the minute we're pitching a series where I go around the world looking for the world's biggest crocodiles. Some of them feared as terrible man-eaters, some of them venerated as protective deities, but all through Australia, New Guinea, tropical Asia, all through tropical Africa, and some of these things are the size of buses. So watch this space, we've got our fingers crossed.
Excellent, thank you very much, Richard. We're going to have our Q&A session with the speakers now, so we'll get that set up as quickly as possible, and then we'll go straight into it to try and give us